Mr. Jones, is you cute? Hey, Jones. Hey, Jonesy. Oh, right. Yeah, just set that up right there. Pockets it. Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, yeah, welcome back. Thank you, as always, for tuning into the channel. My phone is going to zero power. Be right back. Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, that was weird, that little opening thing, but I was going to cut it out, but then I thought, I like reminding my viewers that this is not, a multi-part production piece with producers and editors and all this crap. It's literally me, my phone, a tripod, and some comic books. Which, speaking of, today's video, as you can always read by the title, is going to be Notes from a Defeatist by the cartoonist Joe Sacco. Now, let me sort of address right off the bat, I do not know for sure that that is how you pronounce his name. I believe that's how you pronounce it. For years I was calling him like just Joe Sacco, but I actually read his article on Wikipedia and then just some general biographical info, and usually the pronunciations, it's Sacco. Sonia, stop shooting on yourself. Yeah, so as always, when it comes to names and stuff, I apologize. I humbly apologize if I, ever butcher anybody's names. Just laugh at me in the comment section. Moving on. Now, if you've never heard of Joe Sacco before, he's a cartoonist, obviously, but he's a cartoonist whose work is unique in the fact that he is one of the few artists out there that are really kind of pushing the medium into a really interesting direction, particularly in the realm of nonfiction comics. Now, Notes from a Defeatist is going to include fictional comics, but when we talk about Joe Sacco, we have to recognize that this is a man whose work has predominantly been noted for his attempts at using the medium of comics for the purposes of journalism. The book of his that I had actually, the first book of his I had ever actually read was Safe Area Gorazde, which is about the implosion of Yugoslavia and the mass genocide of the Muslim population in that region at that time. It's a heavy read, and I'm forewarning anybody who tries to tackle it, be forewarned, there's a lot of graphic depictions, there's mentions of rape, there's sexual violence, there's outright violence, including deaths of children. Like I said, it's a heavy read, but it's a good read, and I have every intention of covering it here on this channel at some point in the future. But when we're talking about Sacco's career, his attempts at sort of using the medium of comics for the purposes of journalism seems a little off, because again, most of the books that I have talked about here on this channel have, for the most part, typically been works of fiction. That's what most people have really approached the media of comics with, or at least that mentality. The bias is comics are, again, cute little cuddly characters in Saturday or Sunday morning comic strips that are designed to give a throwaway gag, or else they tend to be super buff men and women fighting aliens and monsters while wearing sparkly outfits. So superheroes and gags, that's typically been the bias. But again, the focus of this channel is to remind the viewer that comics can sort of emerge and be whatever they want to be. And it's largely because of the efforts of a cartoonist like Sacco that more and more new cartoonists are approaching the medium with the notion that you don't have to explore just fictional accounts. You can explore nonfiction themes. And in fact, the book Mouse by Art Spiegelman, a book which has won the Pulitzer Prize, is a testament to that very fact. Sacco's career is interesting, though, because rather than just using it to tackle, say, issues of history or issues of psychology, Sacco's work is approaching the aspect of journalism, a concept or a structure that can be very riddled with bias and can be very emotional, inspiring due to the fact that the events that reporters often talk about can be very sensitive issues. Again, as Safe Area Gorazde or his other book, Palestine, has clearly attested to. Today's book is not going to be anywhere near as intense as some of those other books, but it will be our first approach here on this channel with Sacco. And I think it's actually a good one to start off on, because this book is a collection. Now note, this is not a bound trade like some of the previous superhero comics we've talked about, while some of these works did appear in kind of like small original segments, they would have appeared in comics periodicals, not just individual comics books, or in fact actual magazines. My hand is reaching down because my cat Jones decided to come back out of the bookshelf. Anyway, so when we're looking at this, it's important to recognize this is not going to be a single narrative. This is a collection of fiction and nonfiction works alike. So, looking at notes from a defeatist, let's sort of figure out content-wise what exactly is Joe Sacco offering his reader and why should we really care about it. Alright, so we've done a kind of cursory introduction to Joe Sacco, and of course, as always, I will probably post a link to his Wikipedia page below, largely because Wikipedia is a pretty good resource if you need just some general introductions. And then, as always, most importantly, at the very bottom, there is a further reading section as well as a reference section, which will give you tons of essays and books, and usually websites as well, to give you a nice, good introduction. Now, when we're talking about Notes from a Defeatist, like I said, this is a collection of fiction and nonfiction work, and it's not necessarily a bound trade. This is a kind of collection which is done usually after an artist has attained a kind of cultural capital. In the case of Joe Sacco, the man has won numerous awards because of his comics, largely because of the work of Palestine and then, of course, Safe Area Grazde. This book sort of tries to show the sort of steady development of Sacco as a cartoonist and in terms of establishing his voice. Now, sometimes that kind of statement sounds, it sounds so cliche. It's like, here we see an artist attempting to find themselves. And it's like, oh, God, give me a break. But in this case, I don't necessarily think it's unwarranted. You can tell at the very beginning of Sacco's career, we could see very much a sort of firm tradition in which his characters were, far more often than not, caricatures. This first actual chapter is entitled 8 Characters. I don't have the coronavirus, I promise. I promise. People watching this 5 years from now going, what's the coronavirus? Somebody watching this in 5 years. That's good. Anyway, though, you can tell from this first story, just by looking at some of the pages already, Sacco's work really sort of followed a very sort of cartoony origin. A lot of these characters tend to be highly distorted. They don't often sort of reflect a realistic approach to the human body or the human form, and oftentimes they contain just surreal and wacky scenarios. These first stories are mostly that. Probably one of the best examples, of course, is Zachary Mind Biscuit. Story of a man who discovers that there is a nuclear power plant about to be built at the edge of his hometown. He elects, then, to put his cat onto a hunger strike. He announces to the world, my cat will not eat until they stop building this nuclear power plant. He's then, of course, invited onto television talk shows. Meanwhile, we watch in slow, horrible agony how his cat is just being starved to death. After, the book deals and the television gigs, there's movie opportunities, there's opportunities to have sex with groupies. Meanwhile, his cat dies unspeakably. And then, of course, at the very end, he's so rich he can build a house outside of town so he doesn't have to worry about the nuclear power plant, and then discovers that, what was he saying? Yes, if our military presence in Central America isn't concluded by midnight, my pet bunny Winky goes up in flames. Animal cruelty does not make me laugh. Again, cite the 2 videos I've done about We 3 by Grant Morrison. But all the same, what's really wonderful about these early stories is just how ridiculous and stupid and absurd they are. And you can kind of observe this early work by Sacco was really just kind of an attempt to sort of just hop into the medium of comics and just have some fun with it, which is what a lot of younger artists do. Now, it's in the second part, or really part 3, social studies, that you begin to see Sacco begin to kind of approach the medium of comics from a different perspective. Rather than just kind of trying to come up with weird, zany characters, you see one story here in which he discusses meat. He sort of talks in about how he doesn't really like vegetarianism, and is how, even though he finds a lot of aspects of meat repulsive, he does also, unapologetically really enjoy meat. And as you can tell from the visuals of this, he is sort of effectively telling the story of his love for meat by at the same time showing some of the kind of repulsive qualities of meat. Again, he's addressing aspects of his world around him while at the same time kind of being self-effacing, which is important because even by the time he had gotten to, say, Seferia Grazde, and again, note, I apologize if I'm completely butchering that name, but anyway, if you look at just one passage from this, he says, "Personally, I feel it's high time we developed a hands-on appreciation for the basics of meat production. That's why I've been among the first to applaud the visit of the traveling slaughterhouse to my neighborhood. These amusement parks are both educational and full of protein. Kids like them because they're messy. Uncle, can we ride the sausage pit again, huh?" So, again, at this moment, you'll observe there's a kind of self-parody taking place. Sacco is at the same time trying to make fun of something, while at the same time trying to bring attention to himself as not necessarily hypocritical, but just as human as the rest of us. And this is important in terms of delivering the narrative of a story. Sacco's work, while largely satire, is often about portraying himself and his interest in these scenarios and events, not necessarily entirely as a disinterested third party, but just as an observer to the wackiness, or in some instances, the violence and horror that is taking place around him. Now, a later passage, which honestly I kind of had to skip through most of it because I didn't really enjoy it that much, part 4, In the Company of Long Hair, is a series of usually at the most 2 to 3 page stories about when Joe Sacco was basically a traveling artist with a sort of rock and roll band through Europe. It entails all manner of crazy scenarios where he's getting high on drugs and going on acid trips. Meanwhile, the fellow members of the band are hitching up with groupies. Meanwhile, he is tired and anxious and desperate to get laid and never does because he's usually just winding up selling t-shirts. It's an interesting story, and it's not necessarily that it doesn't have any place in the larger body of work, but honestly and truthfully, it kind of just lagged on, and after a while they began to go, okay, Joe, you hate this. Why are you bothering with these guys then? But whatever. What's important about it, again, is the fact that Sacco was developing a notion of autobiographical comics, and that is really important when we talk about his later work with journalism. Now, another one is his kind of like parody pieces, and one that hits really, really close to home that I love is Voyage to the End of the Library. This is a story in which Joe Sacco just comes out as a full-on cranky curmudgeon. He's talking about all the different kind of people that you see coming into the library. Most of them coming in trying to get the latest Pattersons or Grishams or contemporary books. Meanwhile, the sort of classic literature by people like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Austen are sort of left mired in the darkness. What happened to the great works? And then, of course, he discusses the little old ladies who do nothing but check out all the murder mystery books, which anybody who works in a library knows that is not satire. Like, look at me. That is not satire. Every little old lady going into a library is going to leave with a murder mystery. They love their murder mystery books. But then as well, he discusses the sci-fi nerds and their general quality, about how they're always trying to kind of like proselytize people and being like, oh, this is really interesting because explore this facet here. And what the whole eventual work of it manages to be is a kind of complaint about what's going on with the future of the library. And one of the things he talks about at the very end is more and more libraries beginning to circulate movies in the form of, at this point, really VHS tapes and then also DVDs as well. In this story, it's largely Joe talking about how the library is doomed and, oh God, what's going to happen to this institution? Which clearly indicates to me that Joe Sacco has not worked in the library for an extensive period of time. You gotta do what you gotta do to get books and materials circulating. But, at the same time, what's unique about this is the fact that, again, narratively speaking, we see Joe sort of establishing this tone as an author. He's trying to just sort of situate himself off, not in this instance as a dispassionate viewer of events, but in this case, a fully biased viewer of events. He becomes this grumpy, nasty, kind of strange figure roaming the library, observing human behavior, and more often than not, being just kind of disgusted disgusted with the displays of humanity that are taking place. So even in a face of kind of like satire or even just in the realms of jokes, Joe manages in this collection to really sort of demonstrate what he's trying to do with the medium of creating a narrative voice. And again, like I said, and I recognize we're coming up on 10 minutes now, so I'm not going to spend too much longer here. But when we're looking at Notes from a Defeatist, we have to talk about the fact that this is an artist who's trying to sort of develop their voice and try to figure out what exactly they're doing with the medium and what they want to be able to do with the medium. And one of the most important things an artist can do is find themselves and find their voice. And it's particularly a Voyage to the End of the Library that you begin to really see Joe Sacco sort of firmly develop his voice. Now, one of the later stories in the book, More Women, More Children, More Quickly, is effectively a story about Italy during World War II, which is really interesting, but I'm not really going to talk about it here because, like I said, I'm at 10 minutes. And, you know, you have agency and access to public libraries. You could always check the book out yourself and read it to figure out everything that's in it. The last story that I really want to talk about is When Good Bombs Happen to Bad People. This is a really interesting story because it is composed of nothing but quotes. As you can see by these 2 pages alone, we have 2 central images flanked on either side by quotes. And that may not seem at first like a story, but if you read through some of these quotes, you begin to sort of develop and sort of experience the slow measure of the story. It largely begins in 1940 with the quote, "Bombs are not to be dropped indiscriminately by Bomber Command June 40, which is then followed up with, "The attack must be made with reasonable care to avoid undue loss of civil life in the vicinity of the target. Revised instruction to Air Ministry, June 40. And then followed up with, "We have seen what inconvenience the attack on the British population has caused us, and there is no reason why the enemy should be free from all such embarrassments. Prime Minister Churchill to Air Ministry, November 40th. Now, I'm not going to sit down and discuss the complexities inherent of the bombing of civilians in warfare. That is a complicated issue, in which case I am not the person to ask. Seriously. So if you want to hear more about that, or even just listen to that conversation, I guarantee you there's another YouTuber out there that's going to do it. For my own part, what's important about that is in the course of 3 quotes, we begin with a solid statement of, "We will never target civilian populations." And as he shows you, from the course of June to November, all at once there began to be a new shift in perspective in which, well, you know, it's been proven inconvenient to bomb civilians, in which case then, you know, they're bombing our civilians, why shouldn't we bomb their civilians? The story then progresses forward as you observe throughout the rest of the war as more and more generals become accustomed to the notion of bombing civilians. And even after 1945, well, let's see. Yes, even after 1945, we're still having the conversation of it, going all the way up to, but not limited to, the Reagan administration and the bombing of Libya, specifically the area or the bombing of Muammar Gaddafi. Now, you'll note on page 126, notes Tom, "Tripoli is under attack. Steve Delaney to Tom Brokaw. Next question, "Put your microphone out that window and let us hear it. Dan Rather to Jeffrey Fager." The next line, "The raid began around 7 p.m. Monday, Washington time, and was over the time for a White House announcement to catch some evening TV news shows." Moving on into the actual image itself, we see Reagan saying, "The attacks were concentrated and carefully targeted to minimize casualties among the Libyan people with whom we have no quarrel." The next quote, "This mission, violent though it was, can bring closer a safer and more secure world for decent men and women we will preserve." The story ultimately ends with more contemporary quotes in regards to bombing and how bombs do not in fact impact the civilian population, or they do impact the civilian population, but who cares? It's war. It's what happens. And so it may not seem at first that narratively speaking that is a story, but again, by reading these quotes, one after the other, Sacco manages to demonstrate the course of a mode of thinking over time. And he manages to show you how, even going back to the period of World War II, and even today, there are still conversations to be had about what role civilians can and should play in terms of conflict. And again, I don't have a good answer here for this. I am not a military historian. I am not an ethicist. And I'm not going to stand here and say right now, unequivocally, no. I'm going to say for my own part, I don't believe civilians should be bombed. And I don't think that's a controversial opinion, but you know what? We'll see. What's important here is that in terms of the medium of comics, in terms of narrative, Sacco at that point, at least for me in my reading of the man, had really kind of established his tone. Because at that moment, he had begun to make the shift away from personal commentary into the role more of an observer, just trying to observe human behavior. And I think that's really important when we talk about the narrative of Notes from a Defeatist. There are lots of crazy, wacky stories in this. There are also lots of really tragic stories in this. But what is important nonetheless is that, narratively speaking, Notes from a Defeatist is a great book for observing how arguably one of the most important cartoonists of his generation really managed to find his voice as an artist. Okay. So, 15 minutes now, holy crap. We've talked about why Notes from a Defeatist is interesting from a narrative perspective. Now let's talk why visually Joe Sacco is just effing amazing, dude. Let's get into it. Okay, so, long video, but hopefully not too much longer, because now that I've kind of gone over a wide variety of story types, let's talk about why, formally, I think Joe Sacco is probably one of the most brilliant cartoonists I think I've ever actually read. The reason for this is simple. You can probably see from just some of the instances I provided examples of already, but one of the interesting things about Sacco is not only just his ability as an artist, and I think sometimes he gets really underappreciated for his ability to just kind of compose scenes and landscapes and humans, and sometimes both distorted forms, but then also highly realistic forms as well. But if we look at, say, just the story I was showing you a moment ago, when good bombs happen to bad people, which, by the way, it is important to recognize, one of the best things about it is he provides a works cited to every single quote that he provides in the story. So in case anybody's like, well, how do we know that he's not fabricating this? It's right here. If you don't believe him, go to the article, check it out. Which, also, it's important to note, somebody put a works cited page in a comic. The nerd in me is just weeping. Nevertheless, if we look at just these two pages right here, it's an instance in which a traditional comics enthusiast is going to sit there and go, huh? He's got one image and then a bunch of words and then another image and a bunch of words. Is that a comic? Yeah, it's a comic. Like, hello, I've been doing this for 9 months now, for God's sakes, and you're telling me you just now asking this question? Yes. What we have in this moment is juxtaposed pictorial images in a deliberate sequence for the purpose of creating an aesthetic effect in the viewer or delivering information. In this instance, we have two juxtaposed images in a specific sequence to tell a story and to convey information. That's a comic. And again, this is an interesting structure, and honestly, not the first time I've seen this one. As far as I'm aware, this is the first time I saw it employed in this fashion, but I've seen cartoonists since reading this book who have also sort of employed the structure of allowing a single image and then a block of text in order to sort of create a comic. And it's a comic that some more traditional readers probably are not going to warm up to, which, again, is totally fine. The way you approach comics is going to be different than the way I do, obviously. But nevertheless, it's important to understand that Sacco never approaches comics with the idea of limitation. He is constantly aware of how important the arrangement of the panels on the page are. So if we look at one particular passage, we note a young woman in the realm of Italy who's been discussing when she was a child and the English were steadily bombing her village in Italy. We see her walking down a road when she observes a plane out of the corner of her eye. The plane turns around, she immediately recognizes what is about to take place, she runs, and then immediately has to cower as the plane begins to take aim and fire at her. The page goes on, the plane flies away, and then we're given these long vertical panels. You can see already what's important here is the sense of space, but also more importantly, look at the way he's arranging the panels as well as the word boxes within the page. It doesn't seem terribly significant at first glance, but again, he's trying to sort of create the tension of the realization of, or the panic of, oh my god, one, that's a plane, which means it can kill me, but then two, oh my god, it's a plane and it sees me, I could die at this moment. And then if you look as well of the perspective in this panel alone, it is a gorgeous accomplishment of art, and he's able to demonstrate effectively what airplane machine gun fire would look like and feel like to the viewer itself. Sacco's work is constantly experimental, and it doesn't matter what he's doing or what kind of story he's telling. There is an ever-going concern for the arrangement of images and forms and words on the page. And I pull this page up especially so you can see, in this particular instance, he's describing, being on the road with rock stars and doing drugs and dancing and meeting girls. It's a crazy, chaotic atmosphere, and so naturally, there are scenes in this particular comic where the viewer is left kind of discombobulated, left just desperately searching for a direction in which to follow this work. I never lost my footing. I was able to follow it effectively, but even so, the artwork and the style in which we observe Sacco presenting these characters in this world is nothing short of breathtaking. Now, what's important is some of the later stories that he manages to tell here, Notes from a Defeatist, where he sort of discusses his alienation from society, particularly in regards to a period of life when he was becoming obsessed with the invasion of Iraq during the first Bush administration, as well as the difficulties he was having with a long-distance relationship. You can see the way he manages to balance the use of blacks and grays and textures, and then again, the arrangements of the panels in order to convey his emotion, his alienation, his frustration. Sacco is just brilliant, and honestly, I could show you page after page after page, again, reminding you of how gifted he is as an artist, but at the same time, I think you can kind of see, just from that alone, how important it is. Now, before we leave this section, I did want to bring out a sort of counterpoint or a sort of a supporting argument here, and for that, I'm going to go to this book here, Why Comics From Underground to Everywhere by Hilary Shute. I cannot recommend this book enough. It is amazing. I read it as soon as it came out, and I think I read it in like less than 2 weeks because I was just obsessed with it. But one of the questions she asks in this book is, why war? AKA, why do we feel compelled to discuss war within the medium of comics? She actually dedicates a whole section to Joe Sacco alone, so I'm going to have to read you 2 paragraphs because they're brilliant, and I think they really capture what I'm trying to convey. Sacco is just as influenced by artists like Peter Bruegel the Elder, the 16th century Dutch painter, as he is by 20th century prose journalists like Hunter S. Thompson. Bruegel, known as one of the great landscape painters, holds such massive appeal for Sacco not only because Bruegel is an incredibly acute social critic, but also because his large, detailed paintings are invested in recording customs and practices of everyday life. Sacco often features large, panoramic landscapes in his comics which appear as double spreads, with one image overtaking 2 facing pages. In these remarkable comics landscapes, one also recognizes the influence of some of Bruegel's most famous compositions, wide views full of swarming detail, in which there is no central subject or action. When Sacco traveled to war-torn Grazde, Bosnia for his book Safe Area Grazde, he said he felt that I'd stepped into a painting by Bruegel. One of the Safe Area Grazde's most striking double spreads pays homage to the composition of Bruegel's famous 1562 painting, The Triumph of Depth. From the hills right down to the dog in the center-left foreground, a reproduction of the painting sits in Sacco's studio. As with Bruegel's landscape, Sacco's comics offer rich, detailed views of place that allow a reader to imagine how people live in extreme times and situations. In drawing and painting, media can assemble moments into one dense image. The artist has the ability to record detailed information in a revealing wide or bird's-eye viewpoint. That's the great thing about being a cartoonist, Sacco told the media theorist W.T. Mitchell. If you know something about drafting a perspective, you can pull yourself up. This elevated view of a swarming landscape, one in which many narratives and stories are happening at once in the information-rich scene, is typical of Bruegel. As art critic Jeff Adams has pointed out, rhymes in particular with his 1559 Kermesse Hoboken, which pictures a church festival in Flemish village and a composition similarly overrun with people, animals, and horse-drawn carts. And to kind of put that in perspective, I'll show you the image that they're discussing about at this moment, which is this work here. Bruegel's one of my famous artists. He's an artist in particular that Sacco's been compared to, and of course my main man Robert Crumb has been compared to before. Now what does that have to do formally with Sacco? Well, everything that I've said already. We have to acknowledge the fact that Sacco is a tremendous artistic talent, and he pays special heed to the way that he represents the human form, the way that he presents and lays out panels on the page in order to convey emotion, in order to convey tone. Formally speaking, just about every story in Notes from a Defeatist, even the earliest pages, demonstrate how powerful a cartoonist like Sacco is. And so anybody who's interested in the formal aspects of comics, or is just interested in making comics themselves, really owes it to themselves to try at least one of Sacco's books, to sort of see how he is willing to play with the form in order to get the right aesthetic effect or provide the right information he's trying to give his reader. Okay. Let's do the last hurrah, and then call it a day. Whew. Okay. Well, what more need be said about Notes from a Defeatist? This is an amazing volume. Though it may not necessarily possess the same level of emotional involvement as Seferia Gorazde or Palestine, this book is still an excellent work if you are at all interested in the life and work of Joe Sacco, largely because it collects work from a wide variety of time periods throughout the artist's life, and it manages to show a lot of the different aspects of his career as a cartoonist. For while he's later been observed mostly as a journalist, it's important to recognize that this book also showcases his work in terms of political satire, social commentary, and sometimes just his ability to be wacky and weird and strange, and be able to just show himself in a self-depreciating manner that can be fun to read. Sacco formally is amazing, and his artwork is detailed, dedicated, and always held by a conviction that the medium of comics is a legitimate medium and can be used to create moments that can haunt the reader long after they finish the page. Whether it be stories of children that have fallen victims to enemy bombing, or, God, even just a poor cat slamming its fist against the refrigerator because its owner is a dickhead who wants a nuclear power plant to disappear. Whatever the case, I really encourage you to check out Notes from a Defeatist because it's an amazing book. All right, I'm going to end it there. Thank you so much for your time. As always, I tremendously appreciate it. As always, please like, share, subscribe, all that jazz. It helps me know you're enjoying it. It helps the channel. Hopefully, maybe get me monetized sometime in the future, but whatever. But on the note of money, please don't forget, in the description section below, there should be a link to my Patreon account. I've started a Patreon to help this channel, to help my art. If you want to see that, go to my Instagram account. It should be in the link in my About section. And honestly, it's just a way of helping me keep pushing myself to read more comics, look at more art, grow as a human being, and then hopefully contribute something myself to the culture at large. It's only $1 a month, so if you don't mind losing $1 every month, I will endlessly love you, and I will give you a fist bump through the computer. You earned it. Now, in terms of Notes from a Defeatist, like I said, this is a collection of comics. So some of these stories would have appeared either in various comics periodicals in the past or comics magazines, say, like Slate Magazine, Harper's, what have you. In terms of Notes from a Defeatist, it is a Fantagraphic book, so you can check out their website for the book itself. I believe it is still in print. Double check with me on that, though. Double check your local comic book shop, because one, comic book shops are hurting right now, and we need mom and pop comic book shops right now more than anything else. Check them out. Check out their websites. Check out their actual, brick and mortar establishments. See if they've got a copy. If they don't, they can probably order you one. If they don't, or if they can't, check out your local public library, because if they don't have this specific book, they may have other of Joe Sacco's books, and don't forget, they may also have an interlibrary loan system. Thank you again so much for your time. I tremendously appreciate it. Go read some comics.